There are plenty of videos out there about why we love villains. These are usually focused around specific, well-written bad guys such as Bill Cipher, Azula, David Xanatos, or Bondrewd the novel. And these videos will go into deep dives about why we all love these specific villains, or other bad guys like this. Usually, at some point, they will also state that villains are just more interesting than heroes. What they don't do is ask why we don't feel the same way about all evil characters. Be they villain protagonists, villains who only show up as antagonists to be beaten, or just evil characters who the story presents as the hero, despite how awful they truly are. What's more is that this is a fairly new phenomenon. And not just a new in the sense that the ancient Greeks didn't think like this, but rather, there are people still alive who can remember a time where no one thought villains were better than heroes. There's something else at play here. Something that distinguishes villains that stick with us for years or even decades after we hear them yell, "But this cannot be!" And I think it comes down to the origin of the word villainy. Yes, to anyone who thought I misspelled the title of this video, it's about why we love villainy, not villains. The word villain comes from a medieval Latin word for an inhabitant of a village. Basically, it was synonymous with villager. The word villain, spelled with an E, adds a bit more clarity, stating that the villager in question is a free common villager, so not a serf or slave owned by their lord. So, a villain was literally just a villager who was not of noble birth, but not treated as someone else's property. It'd make sense if the word was meant to refer to someone who was the exact opposite of a noble, but that doesn't seem to be the case. There's one more word whose history we need to look at to figure this out. The term bourgeoisie, a word which I can never spell, has been taken today to mean excessively wealthy, rich, upper class, but it originally just meant city-dwelling middle class. And that is more or less what Karl Marx meant in his manifesto, a middle class that could have wealth and power, but didn't have nobility, divine right of birth, or similar supernatural justification for why they got to be rich. Now, the bourgeoisie were a part of the medieval society since the late Middle Ages, and played a role in triggering the Renaissance. What defined this middle class of city-dwelling villagers was that they could own and buy property, amass wealth, run and operate their own businesses, but they were not nobility. Now, imagine you're walking along in a medieval city and you stroll by a bakery. The bakery windows have been left open, and on one of the windowsills, the baker has left several freshly baked pies. The baker is a member of the bourgeoisie class, and if he lived in a village instead of a walled city, he would be called a villain. Okay, so if that's where these words come from, why are they associated with evil? Why would bakers be synonymous with bad guys? Well, consider how a villain makes money. The middle class of artisans, merchants, and other tradesmen could acquire a great deal of wealth, even in medieval society. In some countries, particularly in Venice and the Holy Roman Empire, this resulted in the phenomenon of merchant princes, people whose wealth had grown to the level that they rivaled the actual nobility, despite not being actual nobles themselves. There are even stories of these merchants with such powerful economic empires that they could threaten the nobility with cutting off their armies from supply chains, while feeding their enemies at discount prices, unless the nobles agreed to more favorable trading conditions. Now, every other wealthy class at the time got rich by basically bullying people into coughing up money so that the ruling elites would leave them alone. The nobility got their money by demanding taxes from the peasants, on threat of death if they did not pay.
Citizens, with the exclusive Megaduck Protection Plan, you're guaranteed to be safe and sound. To join, just send me, Megaduck, all your money, and I'll send you this cheap lapel pin. You wear it, and I leave you alone.
Meanwhile, the church got money and obedience by demanding tithes, on the threat of damnation and hellfire if you didn't follow through. So, same concept, just with more supernatural stuff. But the villains were different. The baker can't force you to buy one of his pies. He can't threaten your body or your immortal soul. All he can do is offer you his handiwork and hope that you'll stop and buy a pie. Without your commerce, without your agreement, your consent, the baker can never grow his business to the level that he can threaten the nobility. I mentioned before in my video about Satan that the idea of a devil who will make a deal for your soul is incredibly old, showing up in Judeo-Christianity as far back as the Roman government. But the idea drifted out of the cultural zeitgeist for almost 1,000 years after Rome collapsed, only really picking back up in Europe after the myth of Faust spread around near the end of the 15th century, by both the New Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church as a bad example to follow. No one today seems to know who wrote the original version of this story, with the earliest surviving fictional account appearing in 1587. Notably, this would have been after a number of merchant princes had grown their mercantile empires to the point that they could start enforcing their agendas over the nobility and the priesthood. Now, I cannot definitively prove that Faust was made specifically in response to the growth of the middle class. But it's a bit convenient that as soon as a group of people appear who can rival the nobility and the priests by making deals, a story starts getting spread around about how the devil tries to lead you to hell through bargains and negotiation. It might be easy for us to look at something like this in the modern world and think that the villains were secretly the good guys all along. This isn't necessarily true, any more than it is today. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, these men wield the kind of power over the governments of the world today that the merchant princes used to hold over the nobility and sometimes even the Pope. There might be things that Bezos and Musk have done that go against the federal government of the United States that you like. There are probably a few things that either of these men have done that you don't like. The point is that the government isn't strong enough to stop them. I mentioned Karl Marx earlier, and stated that the definition of bourgeoisie that he was using in his manifesto was referring to the middle class who could own property. His general disdain was aimed at the class of English people at the time who wielded wealth and power, regardless of how they got it. Marx had a hard time understanding the difference between earning money and stealing it. But the medieval world wasn't any different, and that's not unusual. Most people don't understand that difference. That's part of the reason why wealthy villains are so common in fiction, and why they were often vilified back in the Middle Ages. But from the Church's perspective, there was another problem. The fact of the matter is that the Abrahamic God is, even in the most respectful interpretations possible, an unelected autocrat. Nobody voted for him, he didn't have to earn the position as master of the universe, he just is. And this was used in Europe to justify monarchy as a similar model based on the top-down authority of God. The concept of nobility in the eyes of medieval Europe wasn't just a political one. The Church needed Christians to believe that bullying people into giving you their money and obedience was morally superior to bargaining for it. But there's an obvious problem with this. Putting theology aside for a moment, humans would much rather deal with a baker than a bully. Even when the nobility maintains a great deal of propaganda about being necessary for civilization, we can feel the difference between being forced into a relationship and having a voluntary relationship. Governments have always needed to justify their authority. The people at the top of society always have to justify their place at the top of the pyramid, because if they don't, this happens.
It's time for guillotines. It's time to raise the boards. It's time to sharpen blades. We just can't take this anymore.
Divine right was necessary in the Middle Ages to pretend that the government wasn't just a body of force, keeping the poor under the noble class purely to the advantage of the nobility. Because any system that justifies itself purely with threats of force will eventually run into someone with more force, and that's exactly what the merchant princes of the villain class had become. And this desire to prove that we deserve what we have to other people is wired into our DNA, because even the strongest man in the world still has to sleep. And here's the funny thing. Divine right never really went away. Sure, most people today don't believe in the divine right of kings, or nobles appointed to their position by God. You, watching this video right now, might not even believe in a God, determining what qualifies as good or evil. But you probably believe in something that legitimizes authority. And if you don't, you're surrounded at all times by people who do. In a democracy, we usually call it something like the consent of the governed, or the will of the people. But that's a funny thing. When was the last time you remember consenting to being governed? Was there actually a social contract that you signed when you were squirted out of the womb? Did you ever give consent to being ruled over by your authorities? And what do you think would happen if you tried to deny consent going forward? Would Joe Biden or Justin Trudeau or whoever is currently running your country when you're watching this accept that? And the will of the people, that's just mob rule. At the end of the day, the will of the people is the fickle, unchecked desires of the largest mass of unruly plebs you can imagine. And as the demotivational poster says, none of us is as dumb as all of us. I would rather be ruled over by a benevolent dictator than a fickle Twitter mob. And it's the benevolent part that's so important. At the end of the day, that's what makes authority truly legitimate. Authority is justified if and only if it genuinely wants what's best for the people it's governing. This isn't without flaws, obviously. Who decides what's best? But in simplest terms, a genuinely well-meaning government that is trying to take care of its populace is going to be easier for people to live with than any system of authority that might be more efficient, but either doesn't care for or is openly resentful of its own citizens. And fortunately for those people who lived in the United States, Canada, Europe, and Australia, throughout the 20th century, the average citizen genuinely believed that their governments did care about them. But that's not really the case anymore. Throughout the Western world, no one really believes that the government is just looking out for its people. This isn't just a political polarization thing. This is an issue with important leaders of these nations making it brutally clear that they actively hate at least certain portions of the country, or view them as nothing more than serfs. All too often, we learn that the political class is allowed to do things that would ensure us normal people never breathe free air again. And that's where the old concept of villainy comes back into play. If the powers that be are apathetic at best and malevolent at worst, why are we listening to them? I've noticed something about the villains that people tend to get enthralled by. They're never villains who represent the government themselves. At most, they might be members of a royal family. But most of the villains we get absorbed by are the villains breaking the laws of society itself, such as the Joker, or they're challenging cosmic laws like Bill Cipher. Evil Morty falls under this too, fighting against the multiverse of Ricks he wants to escape from. This isn't the same thing as dystopian fiction or heroes. In a way, these villains represent a kind of power fantasy. The dream of telling our own abusive authorities to take a hike, and pointing a gun in their face if they don't leave us alone. My favorite webcomic is The Order of the Stick by Tim Berleau. While it was originally just a joke D&D comic, it quickly grew into something else. There's a great scene where Belcar, a sociopathic halfling, is undergoing a dream in which one authority figure he actually respected tells him that in the game of society, you have to at least pretend you're playing the game. You can cheat, but you have to look like you're playing the same game as everyone else. As long as people see you as a fellow player, they'll tolerate you. A cheater might be a pain, but a non-player makes people ask questions. It makes people ask themselves why they're playing the game in the first place. And these are the kinds of villains that stick with us. I would wager that every villain you've seen a detailed YouTube video about did something that made you question the rules of your own life. Azula's Machiavellianism probably made you stop and think about why we go along with the accepted morals of society. Sure, she's a princess who is technically part of the government of her own country, but that doesn't stop her from making us ask why we hold the loyalties that we do. Why should we take orders from the guy that's technically our superior if we already know that he's corrupt as heck? Why shouldn't we see him prove he's strong enough to maintain order? And if someone else is stronger, and we've already thrown moral governments out the window, why not follow the strongest person? Nox the Watchmaker, from the show Wakfu, is a villain who questions the very notion that we should accept things as they are instead of turning back the clock to change them. And while we might not have a magic cube to literally manipulate the laws of time and space, how often are we told that we just have to accept things as they are? If you're religious, you're often told that God or the gods or the universe or whatever has a plan. But do you have to just accept the fate that the powers that be have handed you? And if you're not religious but are told that society has spoken and the mob has decided what you should or shouldn't be allowed to do, must you bow before the will of the people? How often are we told that society doesn't owe us anything? Doesn't that conversely mean that we don't owe society anything either? What happens if we just refuse to play the part that we've been assigned? And while obviously the point of fantasy is that we get to see exaggerated examples of these sorts of things, we also see Nox accomplish a lot of crazy feats that no one would believe were possible thanks to his refusal to just accept his fate. And while Nox made mistakes that led him here, he fully admits that and is trying to correct them. And finally, we have Evil Morty again. In some ways, he's the most ridiculous villain I've mentioned here because of how crazy Rick and Morty can get. And in other ways, he's the simplest villain, with an incredibly humble goal: to escape from an abusive grandfather.
There you go, kid. Now you're Evil Morty too. Sooner or later we all are.
If you like content like this, please hit that like and subscribe button. Also, check out my blog if you don't want to wait for my next video. That's where I post articles that I could never put on YouTube. And of course, check out my book, Heroes of Janan, The Science of Magic, over on Amazon. I might take a few weeks off from YouTube for the rest of December to try and get more progress on its sequel. We're in the editing process now, so keep an eye out for it. Thank you all, and happy holidays.